So the effect of the angels, of the angelic fall in the material cosmos. So this is where we can really develop a little bit the tradition of the church on this point. Now, I'm not going to comment authoritatively on this whole question of the evolutionary origin of life. That's not really my wheelhouse. I don't have really any expertise on that question. I will say that the church does give one a sense of freedom in terms of accepting at the very least a non-Darwinian account of evolutionary origins of the diversity of life. What I can say, though, and what I think is helpful in contributing to this ongoing debate, to this ongoing conversation, especially for Catholics who feel compelled to believe in evolutionary origins of the diversity of life, I think that, and this is with the help of Louis Boyer, one of my favorite theologians, in order to make sense of an evolutionary development of the diversity of life in light of Christian metaphysics. Again, I don't really have that horse to back, so I'm not necessarily giving an argument in support of theistic evolution or anything like that. But I am saying that if you feel compelled to go that way, maybe you think that intellectually you just can't cope with a non-evolutionary account of the origins of the diversity of life. And again, the church gives you an ability to integrate that. It does. I mean, if you read Humani Generis, if you read Providentissimus Deus, if you read John Paul II, Benedict XVI, they all do allow for a Catholic to reconcile certain elements of evolutionary theory with the biblical account. But I do want to talk about how the fall of the angels can bear import in a Catholic's attempt to reconcile that if he feels he has to do so. Because if you accept an evolutionary picture of the cosmos, if you accept an evolutionary account of the diversity of life, then you run into this problem of how in the world are we going to reconcile this with the fact that evil is supposed to have come as a result of the fall. And if there was all this death, needless death of animal life, but millions and millions and millions of years before the fall, then are we to believe then that God's original pre-fall in vision of the cosmos was this kind of absurd story of death and life and death and life and death and life and death and life? Is that really does that really capture divine wisdom? Well, Boyer is going to say that the fall of the angels, and I think this is true, by the way, even if you don't accept an evolutionary account of the origin of life. But he's going to say that the fall of the angels, not only did it impact the angelic hierarchies themselves, and not only did it only impact the spiritual security of mankind once he had been created and once he fell, but fall of the angels is because of the intimate union between angelic beings and the material creation. It intimately impacted the harmony of the whole order of the material cosmos. In other words, the material cosmos did not begin to be compromised after Adam sinned so much as after the primordial sin of the angels. Because the angels were created to be these finite reflections of the eternal Logos, these finite reflections of the Word of God, the material cosmos itself, because it's characterized as these further distilled reflections of that eternal logos through the mediation of the angels, they are themselves these mirror images of these angelic images of the image of God. We talked about that before. But it's for that reason that the angels are charged not only with this task of ordering and enveloping and developing and unfolding the material cosmos towards realizing the fullness of that original divine plan contained within the Logos himself. And as a result of the fall, therefore, you have a disruption in that initial purpose for which the angels were created vis-a-vis the material cosmos. So the angels are created with this purpose of modeling by virtue of their natures as reflections of the thoughts of God. They have this purpose to model and to mediate the gradual unfolding of the material cosmos toward its end. And so for that reason, the fall of the angels is going to disrupt that. It's going to stand athwart this this primordial divine symphony. Remember, to go back to that music analogy, they're given the sheet of music to play that will result in the unfolding of material creation toward its full realization in light of divine wisdom. That's their role. And so when you have the fall of the angels, what is the effect that going to be? Or what is the effect of that going to be? Well, the effect is going to have to do with their role. Their sin is going to impact what they were created to do. And so when a third of the angels fall, their purpose still kind of remains. They still have this purpose to play the divine symphony of the material cosmos. But once they've gone bad, they're going to play it badly. They're going to add dissonance into that symphony. And in adding dissonance and disharmony into that symphony, you have a disruption in what was supposed to be a perfect subjection of the material cosmos to divinity. So the fall of the angels, they disrupt this original vision, and they introduce cosmic dissidence and chaos into the cosmos. And what that's going to end up doing is it requires this gradual unfolding of the material cosmos towards its end to arise more from its own dynamic impulses, as opposed to being more immediately subject to divine wisdom mediated through the wise and obedient and loving governance of the angels. And if you do accept this evolutionary account of the diversity of life, and I'm not saying that you necessarily should be compelled to do so, but if you do, the fall of the angels can kind of make sense of why the diversity of life would have enveloped through this very long and arduous and tentuous process. And what Boyer is going to say is that God in his wisdom, and Tolkien also makes this point, that God in his wisdom foresees the fall of the angels, and he makes sure that even though the evil angels are introducing this dissidence and chaos into this divine symphony, nevertheless the order of the divine symphony will win out. And even through its unfolding, you'll have this continual triumph of order over chaos, and that's kind of going to bring about the beauty of the overall symphony in this beautiful way where God can bring good out of evil. And so when you have, before the fall, at least on an evolutionary account, animal death bringing about life, and even sexual reproduction developing out of asexual reproduction, you kind of have this triumph of order and divine wisdom over the forces of chaos and darkness in the development of the material cosmos leading up to the creation of man. And then when you have the creation of man, God creates humanity separately from the rest of this fallen universe, separately from that. And man is supposed to redeem and recapitulate everything that came before, and the world was supposed to have been Edenized by man's cooperation with grace. Once that didn't happen, of course, God, in his wisdom and in his providence, simply becomes man himself for the sake of this cosmic redemption. Now, you could take or leave the evolutionary component, and that general story kind of retains its force. So no matter what way you look at it, I think the fall of the angels do have a lot to say about the compromised state of material creation. So I think the fall of the angels is also even considered apart from the historical development of the world. It's very important in our understanding of things like natural evils and physical evils. We don't have to be committed to this notion.
Anonymous sent $10. Good and evil is man's construct. BC. The essence is the same in which God brings good out of evil. I get too caught up in man's construct of good and evil.
Well, thank you, Anonymous, for the 10. I wouldn't say good and evil are a construct of man. God brings good out of evil, yes, but the only thing that really exists in God, within the divine essence, is goodness itself. And evil, the fall of the angels helps us understand that all evil is a result of sin. Even before the fall of man, all evil is a result of sin, because all evil stems from that primordial sin, that primordial introduction of dissonance into the cosmic, into the divine symphony. And so the evil is always existing under the shadow of the good. So that's kind of how the fall of the angels can help us to wrap our head around the all-pervasiveness, or rather I should say, to wrap our head around the ubiquity of evil in this world. The world is not as it should be, and it's not all a result of human sin. So that's what I would have to say about that. And again, I know I mentioned the evolution stuff. You could take that or leave it. But I do think it's, if you do go down that evolutionary rabbit hole, I think you should not allow an evolutionary depiction of the world to taint your vision of God's wisdom. Because I think that if you take an evolutionary account of the world without the contribution of the fall of the angels, then I think you're diminishing a little bit God's wisdom. Because God, in his wisdom, if his wisdom was not in a way opposed by forces in that evolutionary development of biodiversity, then you have to be committed to the notion that it's God's wisdom and God's wisdom alone that is responsible for that long and drawn-out process. And I just don't think that's tenable. I don't think that's tenable at all. I think you should either be a creationist, where you just reject evolution altogether and retain respect for the divine majesty, or you accept an evolutionary account of biodiversity, but that elongated process is simply a result of this tension between the good angels and the bad angels, where the good angels are trying to bring order out of the chaos introduced by the initial cosmic dissidence, and the bad angels are trying to keep material creation down as much as possible into chaos. And that's how you would have to take it. So me saying all this isn't so much me like arguing for evolution. It's more me giving a cautionary note about how you should contextualize an evolutionary account of biodiversity within an angelology that is traditional and patristic. So that's kind of what I'm saying there. I hope that's understood well.